Your fingers touch the cold window glass before sunrise, and it feels wrong. Not winter cold, not normal morning cold, but the kind that seems to come from somewhere older than the room around you. Now hold that feeling for a second. Imagine a world that had already begun to soften after the Ice Age. Water loosening, ground waking up, the long freeze stepping back, little by little. And then, without asking anyone's permission, the cold came back. That is the beginning of this story. It has a strange name, the Younger Dryas sudden cold snap, named after a flower, Dryas octopetala, a small Arctic wildflower. Scientists found its pollen rising again in European sediment, layer after layer, like winter signing its name where spring should have been taking over. A flower in old mud told them something had gone terribly off course. Between about 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, the warming that followed the Ice Age was interrupted. It was an abrupt return to near-glacial cold. Think about that for a moment. The planet had already started climbing out of one world, and then it slipped back toward another. And the truly unsettling part is this. The clue was not a frozen mammoth or a cracked glacier face. It was pollen. Dust. A tiny botanical whisper saying, "No, the cold is not done with you yet." In the next part, we have to ask the question that changes everything. What kind of force can make a warming world turn around? If you enjoy calm, eerie science stories like this, you can leave a like and stay with me for the next part. So the question is not whether the cold returned. The mud already told us that. The real question is how a world that had started to thaw could suddenly feel its breath turn white again. Picture it in the simplest way. You leave a pot on the stove, and after a long wait, the water finally begins to warm. Then, somehow, someone pours in something so cold, so disruptive, that the whole process stumbles. Not back by a little, back by a lot. That is the shape of what happened between about 12,900 and 11,700 years ago. It was a recovery interrupted by abrupt cooling. And that interruption lasted a very long time. More than a few hard winters. More than a generation adjusting and moving on. Over 1,000 years. Long enough for cold to stop feeling temporary. Long enough for landscapes, shorelines, and seasons to begin behaving like the old frozen world had never really left. Now here is where the story becomes more unsettling. The leading explanation does not begin with fire from the sky or some single dramatic blow. It begins with water. Glacial meltwater. A flood from Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic. A meltwater pulse so disruptive that it appears to have weakened the ocean conveyor, the great movement of warm water that helps carry heat north. And once that flow faltered, the North Atlantic world began to lock up again. But there is a detail hidden inside that mechanism, and it is the detail that makes this whole event feel almost surgical. Because fresh water, of all things, may have been enough to jam an ocean. That is the part that feels almost backwards at first. You hear flood, you think motion, force, noise. You do not think of a system slowing down. But this one depended on a delicate balance. The ocean conveyor works because warm water moves north, gives off heat, cools, and sinks. It is a loop, not a machine with gears, but close enough for the mind to hold. Now imagine pouring too much fresh water into one end of that loop. Not hot, not cold in the ordinary sense, just less salty. Enough of it, and the water does not behave the same way. That is why the leading explanation matters so much. A meltwater pulse from Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic may have weakened that circulation. And once the northward flow of warm water was cut back, The region lost one of its great deliveries of heat. The result was a return toward near-glacial conditions that held on for more than 1,000 years. Try to picture what that means without drifting into fantasy. It means coasts growing harsher again, air with a harder edge to it, seasons that no longer felt as forgiving as they had begun to feel. The cold did not need to conquer the whole planet evenly to change lives around the North Atlantic world. It only needed to stay. And that is the unnerving lesson hidden inside this event. Sometimes, the difference between a thawing world and a freezing one is not the sun above you, but a current you cannot see. Which raises the next question. How do we know this long grip of cold did not fade slowly, but ended with shocking speed? That question leads us away from mud now and into ice. Real ice, stacked year over year in Greenland, where snowfall settled, compressed, and kept a kind of memory. If you could slice down through it, the way you might cut into a layered cake, each band would belong to a different winter, a different summer, a different sky. Those ice core layers do not speak in words, of course, but they do keep score. And what they show about this cold return is deeply unsettling. The chill that held the North Atlantic world for more than 1,000 years did not relax in some slow, patient fade. It ended with startling speed. Several degrees of warming within only a few decades. Sit with that for a moment. Not a long procession of centuries, decades, a span short enough that one lifetime could feel the old cold and the new warmth almost as neighboring worlds. This is where the event stops feeling like a remote chapter in geology and begins to feel personal. Because your mind is built to imagine climate as background, slow, reliable, the sort of thing that changes over vast distances of time while human lives stay small beneath it. But this record says something colder than that, and stranger. Sometimes the background moves faster than the people standing inside it. So now the shape of the story sharpens. First, a warming world stumbled into abrupt cooling. Then that cold held on. And then, at the end, it released with astonishing speed. Which leaves us with a harder question than the one we started with. What would a change like that actually feel like if you were alive beneath it? That is the part your body understands faster than your mind does. 1,000 years is too large to feel. It slips away into fog. But a few decades, that is different. That is the length of a life changing while the same hands still remember the old cold. The same doorway, the same shoreline, the same breath in the morning air. And yet the world on the other side of it no longer behaves the way it did before. This is why the end of that long chill matters so much. Greenland preserved it in ice core layers, and those layers say the release was astonishingly fast. Several degrees of warming within a few decades. More like a locked room opening all at once, and the air inside changing before habit has time to catch up. If you want an ordinary comparison, think of a house after a hard winter. All season long, doors stick, pipes groan, windows bloom with frost, and cold becomes part of the routine. Then, spring finally comes, and in just a short while, the same rooms smell different, sound different, feel different against your skin. Now enlarge that feeling until it covers seas, winds, and whole regions. The eerie thing is that this story has two speeds at once. The cold return held on from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, and yet its ending moved with the quickness of memory. So the next question is almost unavoidable. If the release could happen that fast, how sudden did the beginning feel to the world caught inside it? That is where the event stops being a diagram and starts feeling like weather against skin. If you had lived inside that long relapse, You would not have called it by any name. You would have known it as shorter growing seasons, harsher air, water edged with chill, and mornings that stayed hard when they should have begun to soften. This is what abrupt cooling really means in lived terms, the steady return of difficulty. The kind you feel in your hands first. And because it lasted from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, it would have had time to teach its own routine. That matters. A cold year is one thing. A cold stretch long enough to shape memory is something else. People adapt to what stays. Animals do too. Shorelines, plants, winds, the rhythm of movement across the North Atlantic world. All of it begins to settle around the colder rule. Then imagine what it means for that rule to break within a few decades. Not only would the air change, expectations would change. The same paths would behave differently. The same seasons would arrive with a different texture. A place that had trained you for one kind of world would begin, quickly, to resemble another. And that may be the deepest unease inside this whole story. Stability only felt that way while it lasted. So now we have two speeds living inside the same event. A 1,000-year grip and a release quick enough to fit inside family memory. Once you see that, another question begins to press in. Was this only a regional cold snap, or was the whole climate system trembling with it? That is where you have to be careful, because the cold did not need to spread like a neat blanket to matter. This event is strongest in the North Atlantic world. That is the heart of it. That is where the weakened circulation matters most, where the loss of northward heat could bite hardest, where the long return of cold could reshape coastlines, air, and seasons. And yet, climate is not a row of separate rooms with locked doors. It is more like a house, with floorboards that carry every step. Disturb one end, and something trembles elsewhere. So when you ask whether this was only local, the honest answer is more unsettling than a simple yes or no. The signal is clearest in one region, but the system around it is connected. Winds do not stay politely in place. Water does not ask permission before carrying change. Cold in one part of the house can alter how the whole place breathes. It changes the scale of the story. This was not just a bad stretch of weather in one corner of the map. It was a shift in the machinery itself. A world that had begun to recover was forced, for more than 1,000 years, to live under a different rule. And when that rule finally broke, it broke fast. You can feel the shape of the warning in that, something colder and more useful than panic. Systems that seem steady may only be steady because nothing has pushed them past the point where they answer back. And once you start thinking that way, another question comes forward almost on its own. If the planet can change by crossing a threshold, how close do people ever come to noticing the threshold before they cross it? This may be the most human part of the whole thing. Thresholds are almost never announced. They do not ring bells. They do not send warnings in clear words. Most of the time, a system moves by inches. A little more fresh water here, a little less sinking there. A current weakens, not enough to alarm anyone watching only one season at a time. Then one day, the balance is no longer the balance it was. The floor gives, but only after a long silence. That is why this cold return feels so unsettling even now. Not because it was noisy, but because it may have begun in a way that was easy to miss while it was building. The meltwater pulse didn't have to look dramatic every moment to change the whole direction of the North Atlantic world. It only had to keep pushing the same vulnerable part of the system until the old pattern failed. You know this feeling from ordinary life. A door sticks a little more each winter, and then one morning, it will not open. A pipe rattles for weeks, and then suddenly, the water stops. The final moment feels abrupt, but the strain was gathering long before that. This event seems to have worked in much the same way. The snap felt sudden because the threshold was crossed suddenly. The pressure leading to it may have been accumulating in near silence. And once the colder state took hold, it stayed long enough to feel normal. That is what makes the next step so eerie. If the beginning may have been a quiet crossing of a line, then the traces of that line should still exist somewhere, not in legend, not in guesswork, but in the physical record itself. And that is exactly why this story is so convincing to scientists, because the traces do exist, and they do not all come from the same place. One clue sat in European sediment, in the return of that Arctic flower's pollen. Another sat in Greenland, pressed into ice core layers year after year. Different materials, different settings. Mud in one place, ice in another. And yet, both point toward the same unsettling shape. Warmth had begun, abrupt cooling interrupted it, and the cold held on far longer than intuition wants to allow. That matters more than it may sound at first. When separate records agree, the story stops being a guess built on one fragile hint. It starts to feel like a room seen through two windows. You are not relying on one reflection anymore. You are seeing the same furniture from different angles. And then there is the timing. About 12,900 years ago, the return of near-glacial cold begins to show itself. About 11,700 years ago, the release appears. And in Greenland, that release looks shockingly fast. So now, the event has a structure you can hold in your mind. A start, a long grip, a sudden letting go. Even the name carries that layered feeling. It comes from a flower, but the story it points to is anything but delicate. A small Arctic bloom became the label for a climate reversal that bent whole regions back toward cold. So the evidence is no longer the mystery. The deeper mystery is human. If the air changed, the waters changed, and the seasons changed, what happened to the people living inside that long interruption? That is where the story becomes harder to keep at a safe distance. When climate shifts on the scale of this event, people do not experience it as a graph. They experience it as the ground changing its habits. A shoreline that no longer gives the same return. Air that cuts longer into the year. Water that behaves differently. Food that comes late, thin, or not where it used to be. The Younger Dryas sudden cold snap did not have to explain itself to the people inside it. It only had to keep rearranging the rules around them. And the cruel part is that this was not a single bad season you could wait out. From about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, the cold spell lasted long enough to become the texture of life. Long enough for children to grow up inside it and think of that hardness as normal. Long enough for memory itself to split. Older people remembering the thaw that had begun before. Younger people knowing mostly the relapse. This matters because humans are good at adapting, but adaptation is not comfort. It is work. It is paying attention. It is changing routes, changing timing, changing expectations, again and again, without ever being told whether the world will settle or lurch once more. So when you ask what happened to the people living through it, the first honest answer is simple. They would have been forced into uncertainty for generations. And uncertainty, when it lasts that long, does something powerful. It does not just change where you walk or what you gather. It begins to shape what kinds of choices a society can afford to make next. And that is where climate stops being scenery and starts becoming pressure. When the world turns colder for long enough, people begin making different bets about the future. A group that once trusted a place may trust it less. A route that once paid off may fail too often. A season that used to arrive with some kindness may begin coming lean, sharp, and late. The cold itself is only part of the story. The larger part is what repeated uncertainty does to decision-making. You can feel this even in ordinary life. If the power in your home flickers once, you shrug. If it flickers every week, you start buying candles, charging batteries, changing habits, sleeping differently. The event works like that, only on the scale of land, water, food, and years. It teaches caution. It punishes assumptions. It rewards whoever notices change fastest. That is why this long interruption may matter far beyond temperature alone. Not because it gives us a neat fable, and not because every human response can be mapped cleanly onto one cold period, but because instability has a way of forcing innovation. When the world becomes less generous, memory matters more. Timing matters more. Cooperation matters more. The cost of being wrong rises. And then there is the darker side of that pressure. A climate that keeps shifting does not only change choices in one generation, it can narrow what feels possible across many of them. Whole ways of living can begin to feel fragile. So the next question is not only how people endured the cold, but whether that long strain helped push human societies toward entirely new ways of securing food, place, and time. And that possibility is one of the most fascinating things hidden inside this cold return. Not because it gives us a simple cause and effect story for everything humans later became. It doesn't. Real life is never that neat. But long pressure changes behavior. When the air hardens, when water shifts, when familiar places stop paying back in the old way, people start experimenting, not out of curiosity alone, but because uncertainty becomes expensive. That is the key feeling here. Under a long climatic strain, every mistake costs more. Choosing the wrong season matters more. Trusting the wrong place matters more. Waiting too long matters more. Over time, that kind of pressure can make stability itself feel precious. Something more basic than comfort. Reliability. A place that gives. A pattern that holds. So when people living through this event searched for food, shelter, and timing they could trust, the climate was not just background weather. It was shaping the price of every decision. And when that pressure lasts across generations, it can push whole communities toward new habits, storing more carefully, watching more closely, returning more deliberately, trying to reduce risk where they can. That does not mean the Younger Dryas sudden cold snap created later human change by itself. That would be too easy, too tidy. But it may have tightened the world enough that certain choices began to feel less optional and more necessary. And there is something quietly haunting in that thought. A climate shift need not invent a new society from scratch. It only needs to narrow the room until different choices start to look like the only choices left. Which raises a harder question. If instability can reshape human behavior, what does it leave behind in the way we think about our own security now? And that is where this ancient cold snap begins to lean uncomfortably close to the present. The world now isn't the same world then, but the lesson underneath it is disturbingly familiar. People love to think of climate as the stage set behind human life, fixed, passive, slow. Something outside the room, while the real story happens inside. This event says otherwise. It says the room itself can change shape while you are still living in it. That is the deeper mark left by that long interruption. More than colder air or harsher seasons or the strain of finding enough in a less reliable world. It is the collapse of a comforting illusion, the illusion that stability is normal, that if warmth has begun, it will simply continue, that systems, once helpful, stay helpful. But the old record says no. A warming world can hesitate. A supportive pattern can fail. A long freeze can return and stay. And then, just as unsettling, that colder order can break again with astonishing speed. So what does that do to the way you think? It should make you more careful with words like permanent, more suspicious of phrases like the new normal, more aware that the most dangerous changes are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they begin with thresholds crossed quietly, and only later do they show their full cost. That may be the most valuable thing this event offers us now. Not a prophecy, not a slogan, but a correction. A colder, humbler picture of how the world behaves. And once that correction settles in, another question follows almost immediately. If ancient climate could reverse so sharply without human help, what should it mean that we are now pushing on the same system ourselves? That is the point where the story stops feeling ancient and starts feeling uncomfortably relevant. Not because this was the same world you live in now. It was not. The causes are not identical, the landscapes were different, and the people inside that cold snap were living under conditions far more exposed than yours. But the lesson is still there, hard and plain. A climate system can look settled until it isn't. It can seem to be moving in one direction and then reverse in a way that changes everything downstream. What makes this event so useful and so eerie is that it gives you a natural example of sensitivity. A huge system was nudged at a vulnerable point. Fresh water entered where salinity mattered. The circulation weakened. Warmth stopped traveling north the same way. Cold returned. None of that requires myth. None of it needs fantasy. The mechanism is unsettling enough on its own. And then there is the part that should stay with you longest, the timescale mismatch. More than 1,000 years of colder conditions, yes, but the release, the end of that grip, came within decades. That is what makes the whole thing feel less like a slow drift and more like a system with hidden hinges. You know that kind of hinge from ordinary life. A staircase can hold for years with one loose step. And then one day, the weakness matters all at once. A machine can hum along, right until the part carrying too much strain finally gives. So when people speak as if climate is always slow enough for comfort, this old cold snap stands there in quiet disagreement. And now we have to ask the sharper question. If the system could flip so fast naturally, what does that tell us about the danger of pushing on a system that has flipped before? That is the warning hidden inside this old climate reversal, and it is quieter than people expect. The danger is not only cold, it is sensitivity. A system can absorb strain for a long time and still look calm on the surface. Then, one weak point gives way, and everything connected to it begins to answer. In this case, the weak point was tied to fresh water, salinity, and the northward movement of warmth. Once that balance was disturbed, the colder state did not tap politely at the door. It settled in. And that should change the way you hear modern confidence. People often speak as if a stable climate is the default setting of the Earth, as if the background will remain obedient while human life goes on in the foreground. But this event says the background has teeth. It can pause. it can reverse. It can hold one pattern for more than 1,000 years and then leave it within a few decades. That does not mean every present fear maps neatly onto that ancient episode. It does not. But it does mean the system has a history of fast answers once certain limits are crossed. That is the lesson worth keeping. Respect. Respect for hidden thresholds, for chains of cause and effect that begin in water and end in air, coastlines, food, and memory. You can almost feel why that matters. The old cold snap was not a myth, not a legend, not a dramatic tale polished by retelling. It was a real rearrangement of the world, and the world kept the record. So now the question sharpens one last time before the deeper turn. If the planet can answer stress that quickly, why do human beings keep mistaking temporary balance for a guarantee? That may be the simplest answer, because balance feels so ordinary while it is holding. You wake up, the tap runs, the room is warm enough, the seasons arrive in roughly the order you expect, and your mind quietly files all of that under normal. Just normal. That is how people have always lived inside stable periods, by mistaking repeated success for permanence. This old event cuts straight through that habit. The warming after the Ice Age had already begun. Then, a fresh surge from Lake Agassiz appears to have weakened the ocean conveyor, and the northward flow of warmth was reduced enough for the North Atlantic world to slip back toward near-glacial cold. It stayed there for more than 1,000 years. Then, astonishingly, Greenland's record shows the release coming within only a few decades. That sequence matters because it offends human intuition twice. First, a recovery can reverse. Second, a long regime can end quickly. We are comfortable with straight lines. The planet is not required to give us straight lines. And once you accept that, the ancient story starts to change shape in your mind. It is no longer only about one long, cold return. It becomes a lesson in how hidden dependence works. Warmth in one place can depend on moving water somewhere else. A small change in the right part of the system can travel farther than common sense expects. The comfort you feel at the surface may rest on machinery you never see. Which is why the next part of the story matters so much. Because once you stop treating stability as a guarantee, you begin to see what this old cold snap really says about human strength. And what it says is not that humans are masters of stability. It says something almost opposite. For most of our story, people did not control the background conditions of life. They watched them, guessed at them, adapted to them, suffered under them, and survived them when they could. That is the human strength this old cold return points toward. Not invincibility, not dominance, but responsiveness. The ability to notice, remember, share, and adjust before a bad season becomes a fatal one. That matters because the event we've been following was merciless in one very specific way. It punished certainty. If you assumed the warming would simply continue, you were wrong. If you assumed the colder state, once settled, would last forever, you were wrong again. The world changed its terms twice. First into a long chill, then out of it, fast enough for memory to feel the break. There is something almost stern in that pattern. It does not flatter us. It does not tell us we are living on a predictable stage built for our comfort. It tells us we are living inside systems that can shift underneath our feet, and that whatever strength we have comes from flexibility more than control. You can hear that as bad news if you want, but there is another way to hear it. If the ancient world demanded alertness, cooperation, and adaptation, then those are not minor human traits. They are old tools, proven ones. And now the story turns inward a little. Because once you stop thinking of climate history as distant scenery, you begin to ask a more personal question. What exactly does it change in the way you think about your own ordinary life tonight? And maybe the first thing it changes is smaller than you expect. Nothing as grand or polished as your politics or your philosophy. Something quieter. The way you notice the ordinary background of your life. Warm water from a tap. A room holding heat. Food arriving when you expect it. Seasons behaving close enough to plan around. Most days, those things feel too common to deserve wonder. This old event suggests they deserve more respect than that. Because the people living through that long, cold return did not have the luxury of thinking the background would take care of itself. The background was the problem. Air, water, timing, movement, return, all of it had become less reliable. And once you understand that, the comfort of your own routines begins to look a little different. Not fake or fragile in a melodramatic way, just contingent. Held in place by systems that can be stable for a long time without being permanent. That is meant to sharpen your sight, not frighten you. The world preserved this lesson in flower pollen, in old mud, in Greenland ice, in the memory of a thaw interrupted and a deep chill that lasted more than 1,000 years. Then, at the end, in only a few decades, the grip loosened. The same planet that had held cold so long shifted again with startling speed. So the personal meaning is not that everything is unsafe. It is that normal is more precious and more active than it feels while you are living inside it. And once you really let that in, one last turn of the story begins to open. Because this ancient cold snap is not only a warning, it is also, strangely, a promise. And the promise is easy to miss if you stay only with the fear. Yes, the old cold return is a warning about thresholds, hidden dependence, and the danger of trusting a stable world too casually. But it is also evidence of something else. The people who lived inside that long strain were carried by response, not certainty, by watching carefully, by adjusting when conditions changed, by finding ways to go on when the background of life stopped behaving. That matters because it shifts the emotional center of the story. The lesson is not humans are doomed when the climate moves. If that were the lesson, there would be no one left to remember any of it. The lesson is harsher and more hopeful at the same time. Human beings come from a deep history of living inside uncertainty, imperfectly and with loss and fear, but with enough stubbornness, memory, and cooperation to keep going. You can feel the truth of that in the structure of the event itself. A warming world reversed. Cold held on for more than 1,000 years. Then, the grip ended within only a few decades. Life had to endure both the long hardship and the sudden shift out of it. Endurance was not one skill, it was many. So the promise is capability, not comfort in the soft sense. The ordinary human ability to learn a changing world and keep moving inside it. And that is where the story becomes strangely intimate again. Because once you understand that this ancient event was both warning and promise, you begin to ask whether those same old strengths are still sitting quietly inside your own everyday life. And those strengths are probably less dramatic than people imagine. Not heroic in the movie sense, more like small acts repeated until they become survival. Paying attention, remembering what changed, sharing that memory, adjusting before the old pattern fails you again. That is the kind of resilience a long cold return would have demanded. and it is still the kind that matters most when the world becomes less predictable. There is something almost comforting in that. The promise inside this ancient event is not that the Earth is gentle. It clearly is not. The promise is that human life has always depended on the ability to live inside moving conditions without needing the world to stand still first. People endured the long grip. They endured the abrupt release. They had to survive both the slow pressure and the quick turn. That matters because we tend to admire the wrong kind of strength. We admire control, but control is thin. It breaks quickly when the system beneath it changes. Adaptation is quieter, less glamorous, and much older. It is the strength of noticing that the room has cooled before the pipes freeze. The strength of changing course before the old road disappears. The strength of not confusing comfort with safety. So when you look back at that 1,000-year interruption, followed by warming within only a few decades, you are not only looking at a climate story. You are looking at a test of what kind of creature a human being has had to be for a very long time. And that brings us very close to the final question now. If this old event reveals both the fragility of the world and the flexibility of the people inside it, what does that make you here tonight in your own warm room? And maybe that is the strangest part of all. The more personal this story becomes, the less dramatic it needs to be. You do not have to imagine yourself crossing an ice field or staring at a frozen coast or living through 1,000 years of cold. You only have to notice what your own life rests on. Predictable mornings, water that comes when you turn a handle, heat moving through walls, food appearing on shelves in the season you expect it. Most of modern comfort is really confidence in patterns. Quiet confidence, so constant you barely feel it. This old event unsettles that confidence, but it does something better too. It teaches proportion. The world has changed sharply before. Warmth returned after the Ice Age. Then, a flood of meltwater helped weaken the ocean conveyor, and the North Atlantic world slipped back toward near-glacial cold. That colder state lasted more than 1,000 years. Then, within only a few decades, the grip loosened. So what does that make you here tonight? Neither helpless nor secure in some absolute sense either. Something more honest than both. A person living inside systems that are real, powerful, and not fully obedient, but also a person built to notice, learn, and adapt. That may sound small at first, but quiet strengths are usually the ones that last. And once you see yourself that way, the fear changes shape. It stops being only fear of what the world can do. It becomes a deeper respect for what it asks of the people inside it. Which leaves one final turn before this story can rest. If the planet's lesson is humility, what is the human answer supposed to be? And maybe the human answer is simpler than pride ever allows. The answer is attention, not conquest, certainty, or the fantasy that we finally stand outside the rules that governed every life before us. A steadier kind of attention than panic gives. The kind that notices dependence without collapsing into fear. The kind that understands that warmth, food, water, timing, and trust are never separate for very long. That is why this story matters so much at the end. A flower in old sediment named the event. Ice remembered its speed. Water carried its force. And everything about it pushes against one dangerous habit in the human mind. The habit of calling something permanent just because it has lasted for a while. This long cold return broke that illusion once when warming was interrupted, and then broke it again when the colder world released its grip within only a few decades. So humility here is accuracy, not weakness. To hear that properly is not to become afraid of every season, every winter wind, every change in the sky. It is to stop mistaking comfort for control. The people who lived through that thousand-year interruption were not saved by pretending the world was stable. They were carried, as far as anyone can be, by noticing what changed and changing with it. That is a hard lesson, but also a deeply human one. Because once you give up the dream of perfect control, you are left with something more useful: care, memory, cooperation, and the willingness to adjust before the cost becomes unbearable. And that leaves us with only one quiet step now. If humility is the lesson, what does reassurance sound like after a story like this? And maybe reassurance after a story like this does not sound like denial at all. It does not say nothing can change. The old record would laugh at that. It does not say, relax, the world has always been safe. That would not be true either. Reassurance, if it is honest, has to begin somewhere firmer. It has to begin with the fact that people have lived inside unstable conditions before, and the human answer was never perfection. It was persistence. That matters more than it first seems. When you accept that the world can shift, that warming can be interrupted, that cold can hold on for more than 1,000 years, that even such a grip can loosen within only a few decades, you are left with two choices. You can hear only the threat in that, or you can also hear the proof hidden beside it. Life did not stop. People did not vanish from the story. They endured the long pressure and then endured the change out of it. So reassurance is not the promise of a motionless world. It is the memory that human beings were never built for a motionless world in the first place. There is a strange peace in that if you let it settle. You do not need to control every current, every season, every turn in the system to belong here. You need to pay attention, stay connected, and respond well when the ground changes its mind. That is older than fear, older than comfort, maybe older than anything you call normal. And with that, we are almost back in your room now, because the last thing this story has to give you is not another warning, but a way to lie down beside it. So here, at the end, reassurance sounds almost like a room settling. The heater clicks once in the wall. The glass has gone dark. Your hands are warm again. And somewhere under old European mud, under Greenland ice, under the memory of 1,000-year return to cold and a release that came within only a few decades, the lesson remains exactly where the world left it. In pollen, in water, in layers. Not in a monument or a warning carved for us on stone. That is the clearest wisdom the story offers. The smallest things kept the truth. A flower no bigger than your palm marked the return of cold. A buried record of ice held the speed of its ending. What mattered most was not loud when it happened, and it is not loud now. The world changes by currents, by thresholds, by quiet shifts that only look invisible until they have already rearranged everything around them. And still, morning came after that cold. Morning came after the long hold. Morning came after the decades when the grip loosened. The water moved again. The air changed again. Life did not wait for certainty before continuing. So you do not have to force this story into comfort or fear. Let it be heavier than comfort and gentler than fear. Let it be what it is: A cold, old memory of a planet that can turn sharply, and of people who learned again and again to live inside the turning. The room is still now. The window holds only your faint reflection, and beyond the glass, the night keeps its weather to itself.